Okay. Okay, so yeah, great hello. I will first go through some of the technicalities because before we jump right into our lecture and into the topic. So as maybe some of you have seen, we have disabled the chat function for this lecture. So we are only using the Q&A function, and please use this heavily and as you wish. There are two different options of posing a question. One is if you do not write your name, so you've asked the question anonymously, we will just, or I will just read it out later when we have time for the Q&A. If you write your name and the question, we will then later call upon you, so you can ask your question in person to Surbhi. There is also the function of liking a question, which is always a nice feature. So if you find like a certain question really interesting, please hit the like button so we can share it with everyone. Then again, as I mentioned, this lecture is being recorded and later made available on YouTube, also because, as hopefully many of you know, this evening lecture is part of the Summer Academy for Pluralist Economics, and we have participants from all over the world joining. So for some, it's like late at night or really early in the morning, and obviously they will not be able to make it. But to still share the knowledge with them, and also if some of you want to rewatch this later again, this session will be made available on YouTube. However, please have in mind that if you pose a question in person or we let you speak, you will be part of the recording, or your voice and video will be part of the recording. Okay, so much to the technicalities. Now I will introduce our speaker. So today's lecture will be held by Dr. Surbhi Kesar. Surbhi is the lecturer at SOAS University and she teaches courses on global economic policy and growth and development. Before joining SOAS, Surbhi was an assistant professor of economics at the Azim Premji University in Bengaluru, and she received her PhD from the South Asian University in New Delhi, during which a time as a PhD student, she also spent some time as a Fulbright scholar at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. So this research focuses around different topics of issues of labor, production, informality, and precarity. And she puts a particular focus on critiquing the eurocentric and generally flawed notion of development as a capitalist transition by focusing on the reproduction of economic dualism, especially in India. And together with collaborators and co-authors, she argues that in order to understand the phenomenon of precarity in the global South, there is a need to have a global South analysis and a perspective from the global South that goes beyond this development as a capitalist transition. She's also a member of the steering group of the Diversifying and Decolonizing Economics Initiative. Maybe some of you have heard of it, Decon. It's a really amazing blog where they post like reading lists and great stuff to look up there. Additionally, she's also a really active member in INET, YSI, the Association of Heterodox Economics, Rethinking Economic India, and many other groups. And a personal recommendation, she's a really, really nice person to follow on Twitter if you want to get into like the pluralist heterodox econ stuff. At least that's how I got to know her, and that was really fun. On the topic of today's lecture, drawing from her rich expertise in these areas of informality, precarity, labor issues, and the need to decolonize economic thinking and theory, Surbhi will provide us with an insight in what it means to conceptualize economics from the perspective of the global South. And more specifically, she will focus on eurocentric conceptualizations that are around in economics, especially informality, and that are still dominant today. And she will lay out some elements of a South-centric framework to better understand economic issues around informality. So today, the structure is going to be as follows. We will have around 45-minute lecture by Surbhi, and this will be followed by a 45-minute Q&A. And as I said, you can start putting all of the questions that come to your mind to the Q&A. Please remember, if you want to ask it in person, then add your name. If you want to ask it anonymously, then do not. And please vote all of the questions that you find interesting to it. Okay, so I have nothing else to say. I would say, let's get right to it. And I would hand over to Surbhi.
Thank you very much, Lena, for a very generous introduction. So I'm going to get started directly. I'll begin by sharing my slides. And as Lena mentioned, I will be talking on the issue of labor, work, and informality from a South-centric perspective. And I definitely want to begin by thanking Exploring Economics, which has been an initiative which has been doing amazing work in terms of the Summer Academy, as well as in terms of various other initiatives. Their website, again, is a super interesting one. They've got recommendations of books and various other things that I would definitely recommend everyone to follow. So on that note of mutual appreciation, which I think should definitely be a core mark of heterodox economics, we begin with the topic on labor, work, and informality, global South-centric perspectives. There's a lot to unpack here. And one of the first things is that when we talk about South-centric perspective, what is it that we are talking about, right? And decolonizing economics has quickly become this buzzword that everybody kind of wants to engage with. And a lot of time there's a lack of theoretical clarity in what that decolonizing economics really means. So what I'm going to try to do is provide certain elements that might help us think more productively about the idea of eurocentrism, about the idea of decolonization, and how is it that we can think of frameworks from a non-Eurocentric perspective. So first of all, to clear some ground, when I'm talking about Eurocentrism, I'm talking about a metaphorical instead of a geographical Europe. So we're trying to move away from a sort of a geographical determinism where the idea is that, look, we're just talking about a geographical region. So what is this metaphorical Europe that I'm interested in? It is basically a Europe that came to represent the imagined essence of capitalism. And that essence of capitalism was kind of projected as the imagination, which the entire world was expected to kind of morph itself around. And that Europe representing the essence of capitalism kind of becomes the center of thinking and the center of the economics discourse. What do I mean by it? One of the best ways that I find productive to think about it is that this entire idea of an endogenous capitalist development in Europe is kind of centered in various economic theories, in various economic frameworks, and in various sort of, economic categories that we engage with. And this is something that I'll be talking about in today's lecture. Now, what is this endogenous capitalist development? First of all, the idea that there is an organic unfold of capitalist development is something that is assumed to have been borrowed from a European experience, and it's been imported into the global South imaginary by talking about that, look, this is going to be a similar path that you can also traverse. There's a lot of this, there's many a slip between the cup and the lip here, because first of all, it was not really an endogenous capitalist development even in Europe. Right? This imagined essence of what gets projected as the capitalism was also not something that was all pervasive in Europe. Second, it was something that the underlying processes of colonialism had a really important part to play in it. And again, this idea of endogenous capitalist development kind of tends to write off that entire underlying process of colonialism. And second, which is something that I'm going to build a lot more on today, and I think it's relatively underexplored in this entire discourse on decolonization, is that this entire process was marked by a lot of contradictions and contradictory processes. And this sort of contradictory processes was kind of displaced by this idea that capitalism is an organically unfolding sort of trajectory. Of course, one could argue that, look, you can have an unfolding, but even then there could be contradictions in it, which is a relevant point to kind of talk about. However, the one sort of distinction that I want to make is that several times when we're talking about a capitalist development, the idea that comes with that notion is that it's a teleological unfolding. What do I mean by it? I mean that there is sort of an objective teleos and an end that we are progressing towards. And that sort of progression is something that is almost seen as given under the logic of capital, given that capitalism is an economic system where capital has this logic of expanding to all spheres. What I'm going to try and argue is that there is in fact so many embedded contradictions in the process that for us to assume that there will be this teleological unfolding towards an objective goal, so-called objective goal, which in this case would be that imagined a sense of capitalism that Europe came to represent, is not pre-given. and there is nothing organic about it. And there is nothing that for us to assume that that is some sort of a goal that an unfolding of the economic system will lead us into. Another sort of idea that I want to kind of throw in the mix is the distinction between norms and aberrations, as this idea of a very Eurocentric understanding was kind of being centered. What was really happening is there was certain concepts, certain institutions, certain processes, and certain sites that were being projected as the norm, as the imagination. And everything else that did not mirror this imagination, whether it be institutions, whether it be identities, whether it be economic structures, they were written off as aberrations that needed to be corrected. So there was a norm on the basis of which everything else was defined. One of my favorite examples to give here is the entire discipline of development economics. The entire discipline of development economics actually comes into being because the idea is that normal economics can't really apply to the regions which were not the global north regions of the world. And basically the idea is you have to come up with an entire new discipline which could correct this aberrant phenomenon and first make it equivalent to the norm, and then we can start applying normal economic phenomenon here. So entire development economics came into being as this project of the aberrant. So is this Eurocentric understanding that I'm talking about, which takes as its basis this endogenous capitalist development, which is often not ridden by these contradictions that I'm going to talk about and rights of the various processes of colonialism, how is it that it finds its way into the theorizing of labor and work? So the first idea is that development is kind of seen as not just any value neutral sort of development. You know, development is often thrown around as a word which is kind of synonymous to, let's say, something progress. There's nothing objective about that, right? There's a particular kind of development that becomes centered into economic thinking, and that was the development as capitalist transition, where a less developed economy was defined by a coexistence of a large informal, traditional, non-capitalist segment and a much smaller modern formal capitalist segment. So it was that dual economic structure that kind of characterized a less developed economy, or the economy of the periphery, to stress upon that usage of language. And particularly the huge population was expected to be absorbed in this traditional segment or the informal segment, whereas a developed economy was seen in its structure to be homogeneously capitalist. So that was kind of the difference in the structures of the two economy. And the idea was that the process of development was that of a transformation of the economic structure of the less developed economies, of course, less developed in quotes, along the lines of the advanced capitalist economy. So that is how development came to be defined. And this was indeed very closely linked with, and what is really interesting is in this entire narrative of development as capitalist transition, the idea that it was a common history that was producing development in one region of the world and underdeveloped in the other was kind of written off, and it was posited as if, to use the words of Gilbert Rist, that underdevelopment was almost projected as, a naturally occurring state of affairs, whereas a developed state was something that you had to achieve. It was as something that was produced by a common history, was projected in a temporal space that, look, you're first all underdeveloped and now you can all basically develop. But the kind of underdevelopment that was produced was a capitalist underdevelopment, and that is not really talked about. The entire idea of capitalist development is that of this change in structure, but it was a capitalist development being produced at one place in the world and a capitalist underdevelopment that was being produced in other parts of the world. And I think that's kind of key to a lot of this. And in this, the welfare of labor was linked quite strategically with this entire idea of transition. How so? Through this transition, labor was expected to be absorbed in the modern segment, or this capitalist segment, or the formal segment, as a wage worker, where, so basically, just to kind of clarify what I mean by this modern formal capitalist segment, There's some difference in these categories, but also a lot of overlap, hence the slashes. But the idea is that this segment was accumulation driven, was marked by a capital wage labor relationship. So that is something which was expected to absorb a lot of wage worker as this change and transformation in the structure would happen. And this was expected to be associated with an increase in the welfare of labor, that when you pulled out of this sort of traditional informal non-capitalist segment, which is mainly subsistence-driven, low productive, and is absorbing the excess labor force in the economy, what would happen is as you're being pulled out of it and you're transitioning to this modern segment as a wage worker, that would also be associated with an increase in the welfare of labor. So that is kind of how welfare of labor was linked with the idea of development as capitalist transition. Of course, a lot of mainstream theories that you would be aware of focus on this idea of labor market tightening to increase the bargaining power of workers, because, it's like when you have more and more workers now being absorbed as wage workers, what can potentially happen is that you have a tightening of the labor market, and then you can bargain for higher labor. And this was something that we did see under the Fordist period. And that Fordist period is kind of also projected as the imagination of this development. For example, the post-war period of global capitalism was indeed marked by secure labor relations, where labor was in fact absorbed in this capitalist segment as wage workers. And this was also a period that was marked by rising productivity, high rates of unionization, etc. So that's kind of the imagination of development and its relation with labor that's projected as the imagination. And that is kind of something that becomes a core of the development thinking, but also the thinking of labor and work. And it's, quite interesting to think that wage work, which was not at all the prevalent norm in many economies of the global South for the longest time, was still kind of centered as the norm which everybody else kind of had to achieve. So why is it that, I often wonder why is that we have to start from the vantage point of wage worker and see everything else. Oh, there's a formal and then it's an informal, because, you're not formal enough. And I'll be talking about that in a little while. But similarly, the entire idea of non-standard jobs, there is some standard, and that standard isn't just like a pre-given standard, it's a constructed standard. Even something that's been the norm for the global South for decades kind of gets written off as non-standard. So what are the cracks in this imagination that I kind of laid out in front of you with this, teleological sort of unfolding of capitalist development? Even by 70s, this imagination was no longer steady or very focused, even in the global North or in the global South. What was happening in the global South was that a significant proportion of working population continued to derive its livelihood from traditional non-capitalist segments. And the rise in wage work, to whatever extent it happened, was increasingly concentrated amongst informal wage work. That is, even if you're able to make this transition to wage work, which promised you higher welfare, that's not happening under the conditions that were promised to you, rather that were happening under very insecure labor relations. Whereas in the global North, which was kind of this sort of entire idea or the imagination that the global South was supposed to follow, there was an increased precarization of the wage work. And this has been particularly been seen during the COVID moment. Something that I'm going to talk about a little bit is basically, the Fordist work has become more of a chimera than a norm, even in the global economies of the global North. There's an argument to be made, and there's interesting work by Jan Bremen and Van der Linden and others and Ronaldo Munk, who were talking about that even this period of 70s, like from end of World War to 70s, that itself was first of all, that was a very specific period in the history of global capitalism. And there's no reason why we should think that that is indeed the norm. There was it was conjunctural at that particular point why that happened, and I can come back to that in if we have questions. So just kind of to motivate the discussion a little bit more, what you see on the right is a graph from the US Bureau of Labor Statistics, and it's like a famous graph that I'm sure everybody's kind of seen. At the post-80s, there was a divergence that starts happening between productivity and real wage. So basically the productivity of the firms keep on rising, and the wages, in fact, the real wages, which is like the dotted blue line at the bottom, what you're seeing is that there is basically a divergence between the two, and wages and the compensation for workers is not really in tandem with productivity anymore. In fact, we're seeing a stagnation in the real wages. So this is basically for India. On the right ones for the US. For India, of course, there's been increase in real wages, but so this is not a wage graph, but just to kind of give you an idea that, but even then there's a divergence in the productivity wage gap that's kind of continued to increase. What I have in the left, there's a lot of figures and you can kind of ignore those for a moment, but the point that I want to make is this is from a period of 2011-12 to 18-19 from a paper by Amit Basole, where, you know, the regular wage so if you just look at regular wage and employers, which will mainly be the modern formal segment of the economy, that has continued to remain really small. And what you have, everything else, including a part of regular wage, is actually all informal sector. So roughly we're talking about 70 to 80% of the economy still being employed in informal sector. And the predominant part of that is basically the first two categories, which are non-capitalist, self-employed enterprises working without any wage labor and only using household workers in order to do their work. Much of these enterprises are in fact driven by subsistence logic, the same non-capitalist traditional sort of segment that we were talking about earlier to characterize dualism. So that sort of structure has continued to stay intact in the global, I mean, again, I'm giving illustrative examples, but in India in this case and in US, a lot of that's starting to break down. And again, I'll talk about this a little more in detail in a while. So what is this South-centric lens and what is it that we're trying to do with it? First of all, we're trying to displace this idea of an endogenous unfolding of capitalist development, which, as I began with, is kind of a very central feature of how capitalist development is kind of thought about. Conventional economic theories since Adam Smith have in fact invisibilized the constitutive role of these colonial encounters that I was talking about and the embedded contradictions in the process of capitalist development. And these are the contradictions I'll be talking about in a while. And they've advanced the hope and promise of a full-fledged, autonomous, full-scale capitalist development across all economic spaces. So that has kind of been the imagination. So when we are trying to develop a South-centric lens, what we're going to do is we're going to displace this particular idea that has been projected, and we're going to centrally embed the colonial encounter. Now, of course, there's a big strand of literature in decolonizing, which embed the colonial encounter by talking about the legacies of colonialism. For example, how imperial dominance has kind of continued, etc. What I'm going to talk about is something slightly different, and what I want to do with it is displace this teleological notion, which is kind of a central part. Like I said, like I talked about before, there's an idea of a teleological unfolding, where there's an unfolding towards one objective end defined by the essence of capitalism. So we're going to displace that teleological unfolding and, you know, kind of try to throw that out the window and identify the contradictions that mark the process. To talk about that, look, the process is so contradictory, you're trying to push it in one direction, even if capital's logic is that to expand, there are various other contradictory processes that are happening because of why that might not happen. And we're going to make that at the core of our analysis. And when we're making it at the core of our analysis, we are displacing the notion of this endogenous organic unfolding of capitalist development towards a teleological end. So that is something how we are trying to build the South-centric lens. I'll pause for questions in just a bit. But one thing that I want to kind of talk about here is that, you know, a few of the characteristics of the colonial encounter that I'm kind of throwing in the mix that might be interesting for the conversation that we're going to have is that while, you know, this is a period when capital and wage labor is becoming dominant in the former colonizing economies, the colonial encounter per se is marked by a different kind of contradiction. So what Nancy Fraser characterizes as that the worker in the colonizing economies is exploited, while that in the colonized economy is expropriated, right? You're creating a wage worker in the former colonies, but what's happening in the colonized economies is use of extra market means in order to extract value from the worker. A new mode of production is being externally imposed, and the colonial subject then begins to both be expropriated and also exploited. Now, this, of course, continues in the present day world as well, when there's racial differentiation in terms of, how racial occupational segregation happens on the basis of gender, race, so on and so forth, particularly taking the idea of racial differentiation, how certain racial groups would be paid lesser, the credit rates are higher, etc. So these non-market, non-economic means over and above just a wage labor exploitation kind of continues. But what I want to kind of emphasize here is that the relationship that existed between the former colonizing economies and the post-colonial economies have molded the pattern of capitalist development. And this is what I was talking about, that there's a common history that's produced capitalist development in one part and capitalist underdevelopment in the other part. So it has basically molded the pattern of capitalist development in the modern segment as it expanded by extracting a lot of resources from the non-capitalist segments in the economies in the periphery. And in doing so, it subverted the potential for its own indigenous development on its own terms. And that's something that we're going to try and, kind of speak about. So now I'm going to go to the second part of the story, where I'm going to try to embed contradictions and question this teleological understanding of capitalist development by trying to build a theoretical framework, but also by giving a few illustrations. But I'll pause here for a minute. If there are any clarification questions at this point, I'll be very happy to take them before I go ahead. Just want to make sure that this idea of what is Eurocentrism, what is decolonization, and what is it that I'm talking about when I talk about a South-centric lens is clear.
Okay, yeah, so feel free to post like whatever understanding questions to these concepts you have. What I wanted to point out, I think what is really special in about this room that we have right now, it's like all interested students. And so I feel like these are obviously really big topics and kind of hard to grasp, but please really do feel free to answer, ask the question if you really do not understand anything, because I think the space for it to learn, and it's not a big conference where you have to be cautious of what you ask. This is all for us to understand the questions better. Okay, and on that note, Vladislav, do you want to ask your question out loud? I will try and find how I can unmute you. 1 second. Okay, I will allow you to talk.
Oh, cool. So everybody can hear me now.
Yeah.
Incredible. Thank you very much. I have to say, a month ago, I just passed my final exam in obstetrics and gynecology. I come from a totally different life thing from medicine. So this is incredibly interesting, but it's also a bit complex. Could you lay the groundwork for what this is about and what your field of study is about in a few sentences that would just give me a bit of a milder introduction to what this is about? What's the big problem? What's the big thing you're trying to solve here? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. So let me posit it this way. Okay, let me try a different way of framing. The idea is we talk about, look, there's an influence, there's a colonial influence on the knowledge that we're engaging with. And what is kind of that colonial influence becomes a very big question that, okay, of course, there are problems of who is represented where, that's one of the problems. There's problems of who gets published in the top journals. There's problem of what kind of knowledge becomes accessible to everyone. There are a lot of interesting journals written in a lot of languages, which is not English. How many people are even able to access it? So we're talking about a lot of reflections of a bigger problem. And what I'm trying to do here is try to unpack that in economics in particular, what is the problem where there is a centrality of a European experience in some sense. And what I'm trying to talk about here is that I'm not just talking about Europe being a geographical entity, but I'm trying to characterize it as the center that came to represent what capitalism was supposed to be. And in doing so, there was a particular idea of capitalism and capitalist development that was kind of projected out. And there the idea was that, look, there is an objective end. And what is that objective end? It is that imagined idea of what capitalism is, which Europe was supposed to represent. Okay, so it's that objective end towards which the world is supposed to unfold. What I'm trying to do here is kind of unsettle that understanding, that look, this is not how exactly what it would happen. And I'm trying to particularly look at the issue of labor and informality in order to grapple with this, and which is going to be the second part of the lecture itself. So I am seeing some questions which are very interesting, but those are also questions that I think I can take a little towards the end, because they'll kind of be developing on some of the things. But at this point, if there are any clarificatory questions, you can continue to keep putting in the chat, and I'll pause again in a few minutes, and then I can come back to it. So I hope the part up till now is kind of like, I know they're sort of a little big ideas, but I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page. Okay. All right, I'm going to take Lena's nod as a go ahead and go ahead with it. Okay, so what is it that we are talking about? What I'm going to do now is I'm going to talk about informality as an expression of the contradictory processes that exist in the world of work. Okay, I've been talking about, look, there are so many contradictions, etc., etc. So how do we kind of study these contradictions? And I'm going to propose that informality in the world of work, which often, so it's a funny story when ILO kind of starts documenting informal economy. How does informal economy come into being? The idea is that there's a lot of people in agriculture, in these economies in the periphery. And what we want is, with growth and expansion of the modern capitalist formal segment, we're going to draw out a lot of people from there. And then these people are going to be absorbed in this modern capitalist formal segment. But that really didn't pan out. What started happening was, even as people were moving out of agriculture, they were getting absorbed in, let's say, a lot of non-capitalist informal spaces that were not a part of the modern capitalist segment with the rich, with sort of secure labor relations, etc. And informality kind of became the site of urban poor, where these people do not have secure jobs, are still mainly organizing production without any wage labor. So they had all the markers of what a traditional segment was supposed to be, but now that was being reproduced in the heart of urban centers, even in the global South. So informality, when ILO starts talking about it, is, of course, it's framed as not formal. And also it's funny how, like, they basically talk about it in terms of how ILO has discovered the informal sector. So it's the same way as discovering, this new land, etc. So that is something why informality becomes an important thing. And also another reason is that informal economy is still like the largest employment provider in much of the global South, and has kind of become rising even in the global North. So what I'm going to try to do is I'm going to talk about this particular part of the world of work, okay, which was expected to be resolved with growth, but has rather become a very dominant feature in various parts of the world, and is an expression of these different contradictions that I'm going to be talking about. And when I center the contradictory processes, I'm kind of going away from that earlier teleological understanding. What's going to follow is going to be drawn from one of my co-authored works that's forthcoming with Sneshish Bhattacharya and Lopamudra Banerjee on contradictions and crisis in the world of work. So I'm going to draw certain parts of it. I'm also keeping a tab at the time. So what I'm going to do is identify 3 key contradictions in the world of work, one of which is in fact studied much more, both in heterodox and in mainstream literature. And I'm going to argue that each of these contradictions in some way are trying to unsettle the imaginary of the Eurocentric endogenous capitalist development. The first is that between capital and labor, which is the one that happens in the interior space of capital. I'm going to talk about what's an interior and exterior in just a while. Then there is that between the domain of capital and its outside, and those that are emerging from the dispersion of circuit of capital to its outside. So please don't get bogged down by a lot of these terminologies. I'll be explaining a lot of them in just a bit. First of all, let's talk about capital and labor. This is something that I'm sure most of you are most aware of, and you've talked about it in terms of capitalists and labor bargaining over the share of the entire pie, over the surplus. Various mechanisms have been employed by capitalists to increase the surplus that's retained by it's retained by the capitalist versus the labor. Capitalist usually uses mechanisms like lowering the customary standards of living, etc. And also labor market, whenever they become tight, are made more flexible through the process of higher informalization, which is aided by global mobility of capital, globalization, labor being made global on being made surplus on a global scale, technological advancement, more automation, etc. So this thing between capital versus labor is something that's most studied in both mainstream and in heterodox literature. But what kind of is not studied is the other two contradictions that I was talking about, which I think is particularly informed by the experience of the global South, and which is what I'm going to kind of try to center in next part of this talk. So before we go there, some ground clearing exercise. What is it that we're talking about when we talk about a capitalist economic formation? The idea, like I said, would be that following by a very North-centric view, the idea again will be that, look, we're talking about the possibility of a homogenization of the entire economic structure, which is what we began with. Remember that a less developed economy is this dual economy, and a developed economy is that of a homogeneously capitalist economy. So when we're talking about capitalism, we want to move into this homogeneous sort of structure. However, the idea here is, following the works of Resnick and Wolff and others, that capitalism as an economic formation constitutes of both. It's in fact a fractured site. It consists of both this internal sphere of capital, so you can forget some of the content written in the slides, but what happens in the internal sphere of capital is the one that's driven by accumulation and is mainly based on capital and wage labor relations. So these wage labor relations are kind of dominant, and that is the internal sphere of capital. Then there's an outside of the capital, which encompasses various non-capitalist processes. These could be commodity as well as non-commodity processes. For example, processes that are happening within the households, but also processes that are happening in the market sphere, which is what I'm talking about in terms of the self-employed non-capitalist segments, which do not have any wage labor relations, which are, let's say, organizing production mainly using household labor. So there are both these sites that continue to exist in a capitalist economic formation. And in capitalism, both of them exist. And what I'm going to try and argue is that this outside, which according to a very teleological understanding, which I'm saying is eurocentric in nature, should wither away over time. But I'm going to say that this is not what is kind of happening. In fact, in a capitalist social formation, the conditions of existence for this internal sphere are more dominant. And that is why it's also a capitalism and not another kind of formation that we're talking about. And it is structured by the contradictions between capital and labor in the interior sphere, which is what I talked about, where there's wage labor and a capital relation, and as well as that between capital and its outside. It's the one between capital and its outside that's relatively much more underexplored. What capital seeks to do is reproduce its conditions of existence by managing a lot of these contradictions. So it's not one about teleological unfolding. It's in fact about this constant management of contradictions that it tries to do. And these contradictory processes need to be centered when we are talking about capitalism or capitalist development. So let's talk about these two contradictions. So one, that between capital and its outside. I'm going to try to build in the next few slides a sort of a theoretical understanding of what these two contradictions are like and what do I mean by it. So let me talk about the one between capital and its outside. Here, I'm going to draw from the experience of the post-colonial economies and the capitalist development in it. The process, so this is something that I'm drawing from a lot of literature on post-colonial capitalist development, where the idea is that the process of capitalist growth and development, unlike what the Eurocentric vision is telling us, is inherently an exclusionary one, where what happens is that as you have more accumulation and growth, what is happening is the modern or the capitalist segment is constantly drawing resources from the traditional non-capitalist segments, but in the process of doing so, it dispossesses a lot of people who subsist on these resources without fully absorbing them as wage workers. Now, this population that's dispossessed, whose resources are taken away, but they are not absorbed, they are in fact redundant or surplus for the process of capitalist accumulation. They are not made a part of this internal sphere as capital and wage labor. They're not like absorbed as wage labor, but rather they are completely redundant in this process. So this process where the idea is that, look, and in an initial part, what you're going to have is taking away of people's resources so that they get converted into wage labor and they get absorbed into this internal sphere, is an always ongoing process. There's no reason that that teleological end will kind of be achieved. And the surplus population that we're talking about here, which is the dispossessed population whose resources are taken away but are not being absorbed as wage worker, they have to continuously work to reproduce their conditions of livelihood. And they do so by continuously reproducing this outside. And this is something that we see commonly as a sight in the economies of the global South when we are talking about household enterprises that have no wage labor relation, that are mainly marked by a very household consumption driven logic and are mainly organizing production using, let's say, household labor. Now, there exists a very antagonistic or contradictory relation between what we call the capital and what we call the outside. Here, think about this. What are these non-capitalist sites? These are something that are brought into existence or that come into being, particularly because there are people whose resources are being taken away, they are being dispossessed, and they have to find a way to survive, subsist themselves. And they, in fact, are driven by a logic of consumption need of the household in which they are based. And on the other side is this domain of capital, right? I'm talking about capital and South side. So what is this domain of capital? This is the one that's marked by self-expansion and accumulation. And in doing so, it's constantly threatening and encroaching upon these outside spaces or these non-capitalist spaces. So what you basically see is that there is this perpetually antagonistic relation of contradiction that exists between the two spheres. And in doing so, we are calling into question the historicist notion of these spaces that, look, they were something that existed, and by this teleological unfolding that is brought to you by the European experience, of course, a very partial European experience, is something that would kind of wither away. Instead, they are being reproduced particularly as an outfall of the contradiction which is embedded in the process of capitalist development. And that is something that I'm trying to center here. Of course, now imagine the counter argument can be that why are we thinking so much about these people who are not needed by capitalism or by capital? Why aren't they just left to die or whatever? If they are not absorbed in these spheres, this may cause a lot more political instabilities and upheavals, and that might jeopardize the process of stable capitalist accumulation itself. So in that sense, these non-capitalist segments in major ways are providing a political condition of existence for capital by sustaining and absorbing this huge surplus population that is not being absorbed in the capitalist segment. Now, how is it that it manifests in the economies in the global north? There's a vast segment of the population which is basically being absorbed in this non-capitalist outside, in these family-based household enterprises that I talked about, and that are marked by complete absence of wage labor relations. They're not integrated even with capitalist production in any way. either by subcontracting linkages, gig work, platform economy, etc. And these dynamics, the fact that they're not only driven by accumulation, allow them to also act as a sink for a lot of surplus population that's dispossessed. If they were driven mainly by accumulation, if they're not making profits, they would shut down and so on and so forth. But that's not the logic with which they are kind of operating. So the spaces do exist in the global north, but the process there is different, and I can come back to it if there are questions. Now, what I'm going to talk about briefly, because I also see I'm kind of running out of time, and I want to talk a little bit on the illustrations of both of these processes. So what I'm going to talk about is basically another kind of process, which is another contradiction. And just to kind of recap, I'm talking about three basic contradictions in the world of work. And I'm saying that all the expressions of informality can be traced back to these contradictions. And why is it that I want to center these contradictions? Because my argument is that this entire idea that capitalist development is an endogenous teleological process is something that we have to decenter. We have to center the contradictions that embed these processes in order to make a point that that sort of a vision that's being imported to you, in which you are placing all your categories of wage work, of labor market tightening, etc., is not the one that can be imported. Rather, what we have here are the three contradictions. I mean, of course, it's not an exhaustive set, but that's how I'm able to conceptualize it, is basically that these contradictions are something that centrally mark the process. So we've talked about that between capital and wage labor, we've kept that aside. The second we talked about between capital and its outside, and which gets reflected in the informal non-capitalist sort of segments that exist in various parts of the world, particularly in the global south. Second, we keep it aside. The third one that I'm going to talk about is one that is particularly becoming of prominence today, is that where where capital and its relations are being dispersed outside its immediate sphere, but they do not, in fact, internalize everybody along the capital wage labor relations line. So I'm not going to go into a lot of theory of it. I'm drawing for it from social reproduction theory, but I think I'm going to skip over it and just going to talk about that. How is it that it manifests? Think about subcontracting relations, right? There are a lot of enterprises which are household-based enterprises, which are not a complete outside of capital, which are linked with larger capitalist enterprises. However, they are not even completely brought into the sphere of capital within the domain of capital wage labor relations, right? And a lot of household resources, capital is able to get them for free by accessing these subcontracted household enterprises. Another way in which it exists today is basically the gig economy and the platform economy. And I want to just make a point here that, it's like the individuals still own their means of production. So in that sense, they're not like a wage labor completely interior to the sphere of capital, but they're also not completely disconnected from the interior sphere. The gig worker is often projected as this partner in the platform economy, a self-employed entrepreneur, etc. However, the control over all the decision-making, labor and production processes and the decision-making power still rests with the digital aggregator. So in that sense, the gig workers are almost transformed into disguised wage worker, but being given that sort of idea of being that self-employed entrepreneur, etc. So what I'm trying to talk about here is that what we have is these different set of contradictions that are coming together and fusing together in order to produce certain reflections of informality. And therefore, I'm talking about centering these various contradictions, a lot of which, I've skipped over and I'm happy to come back to. But what I want to talk about now is a few illustrations, particularly from the current COVID moment that we are in, to kind of emphasize this point of how these contradictions get reflected, how they are managed by state and various other entities in order to keep this entire structure intact, while continuing to pose as if there is some sort of an endogenous teleological unfolding that's going to happen. But I'm going to provide some illustrations to show that, look, that's not how we are progressing. We are constantly negotiating along the lines of these contradictions. Going to skip over a few parts, so let's consider a few illustrations. Illustrations from the global south. In India, most remunerative work is in fact carried out in the domain of unwaged household non-capitalist petty commodity production enterprises and that of informal wage employment. The constitution, of course, it's hardly, I mean, it's kind of debated. 80 to 90% is basically the total workforce is informal. These domains, however, are marked by a high degree of flux between them. A lot of involuntary transitions continue to keep happening as people transition between different sectors of the economy. And what we see during the pandemic is these sort of transitions that people are constantly moving across different spaces in order to subsist themselves. It's not just a movement towards wage work or something, but people are constantly moving across these sectors. And that has increased quite a bit. What this means is of different sectors of the economy. Earlier, if 20 to 46% of population from different sectors of the economy were moving to another sector to derive their livelihood, during the COVID moment, that shot up to like 65% from a particular sector. Another thing that comes across, I mean, I'm still making the same point, but the increased agrarian distress in the Indian economy. What has really happened is that it has actually forced a lot of peasant households to undertake these small sort of migrations, short-term migrations, and that has given rise to the phenomenon of a footloose labor. But that again has created new conditions of antagonisms. What has really happened is that this transfer of resources from the agriculture sector or the traditional sector has escalated, and that has heightened again the tension between capital and its outside. A recent illustration of that was the farmers' protest in India, where there was this huge move to liberalize the Indian agriculture. And the idea was that the private sector will be allowed to move into these traditional segments. But what that resulted in is that these people actually do not then have another possible outlet to survive. And therefore, that led to a lot of political upheaval in the economy, because of which the government had to withdraw these laws that they were bringing into force. Now, what has happened is these contradictions have heavily intensified in the period of the COVID moment. First of all, let's talk about that within capital and labor. The intensification has been such that earlier, the proportion of people who were employed in formal salaried job, about 80% of them prior to the pandemic year continued to be in that particular employment type. But during the pandemic year and even later, a large proportion of those who were permanent salaried, in fact, moved out of it. And permanent salaried, I'm talking about the most secure form of employment relations. And what you can see is this heightening of contradiction between capital and labor, and the labor basically being pushed out into more precarious jobs. Then second, there's an intensification of contradiction between capital and its outside that I was talking about. In fact, about 1/3 of wage workers during the period of, the main 2020 period as well as after, have transitioned into self-employment, which is again this non-capitalist outside sphere as a coping strategy. And this was accompanied by a wide distress. In fact, the earnings of the entire pool of self-employed fell by about 18%. And a lot of purposive surveys from the Indian economy show that the ability of the system to hold together has become very frail. There is, in fact, a lot of hunger, indebtedness, etc. Now, even this petty commodity, even this non-capitalist segment that we were talking about has kind of been giving up its ability to hold together as a sink, which was, as I said, it was supposed to play this role as a sink sector where all dispossessed population could be absorbed. And its role as the sink sector has also kind of started to become much more frail. In fact, what we saw in the Indian economy, again, this example that I'm giving from the Indian economy, that migrant workers in India had to undertake a huge reverse migration back into rural segments, into these non-capitalist segments in order to survive. But that, in fact, generated enormous pressure on the rural non-capitalist segments. What did the government have to do? It had to intervene by, in fact, expanding the wage work site. by expanding the publicly provided rural employment guarantee program, which the data shows was highly insufficient and people wanted much more of it. But what's the point that we're trying to make here? The point is that there are these contradictions that are playing out where people are being pushed out of the sphere of wage work into the sphere of the outside, which is what I'm talking about, the contradiction between capital and its outside, so that this absorbs the dispossessed population. However, increasingly, that also has become increasingly unsustainable. So then government has to move in to expand some sort of a wage employment side. So there are these negotiations that keep on happening, and these negotiations keep getting reflected into various forms in which informality continues to exist. And when we're talking about these as reflections of these contradictions, what happens in that teleological understanding is that these contradictions that, I couldn't expand upon quite a bit, but the central theme being that these contradictory processes between capital and wage labor, something that manifests itself through higher informalization, then that between capital and its outside, that manifests itself in terms of an expanding non-capitalist space, but that becoming increasingly unsustainable, and that from the dispersion of capital to its outside, which gets reflected in terms of this higher subcontracting, higher gig work, higher platform economy, and so on and so forth. All of these that are reflected in these spaces are in fact a result of the contradictions that are centrally embedding the process of capitalist development and the world of work. And what tends to happen in that Eurocentric vision is these contradictions get written off. Now, since I've run out of time, I'm not going to be able to give you the illustration from the global north, which is about what has been happening with the platform of gig economy. And let me conclude, and I'm happy to pick that up in terms of Q&A. So for the global south, and something that's kind of been happening elsewhere as well, there is a continual commodification that happens, and then a continual decommodification of labor. That is, what do I mean by it? That labor is increasingly being turned into wage labor, but then again, it's not able to sustain itself as a wage labor and has to then kind of come back and absorb itself as, let's say, sort of in these non-capitalist segments in the household enterprises, etc. And what all of these are reflections of, as I said earlier, is that between capital and labor in the interior sphere and between capital and its outside. And much of the state interventions can be seen as an attempt, as a balancing act to manage these contradictions. So we're not talking about an unfolding of sorts, but basically an act of management of these contradictions. And when seen from the South-centric lens, the idea to embed these contradictions at the center is to unsettle the story of this endogenous unfolding that we started off with. So I'm going to skip all of this and happy to come back to it when there are questions. So to end with, to relate back to the story of Eurocentrism that we began with, in global south, precarity is kind of viewed as rooted in the persistence of a lot of these informal economic spaces and non-capitalist spaces, and which is seen as a lack of capitalist transition. Whereas in global north, what we're seeing is that it was supposed to be the archetype which the economies of the global south were expected to realize. But what we're seeing now is there's this rise in this process of informalization and precarization, both in global north and global south, even when they are at the different stages of the expected linear path of development. So there are basically these fissures appearing at every stage of where you are in this path of capitalist development. And through that, informality becomes a reflection of these underlying contradictions that I was trying to talk about, in terms of saying that these are in fact centrally embedded features of the world of work. What I've tried to do here is identify 3 contradictions which accumulate and are coalescing in the current conjuncture in the world of work. And the very success of the process of capitalist growth, in fact, continue to undermine the conditions that exist here. How so? Just to kind of recap a little bit, for example, if there's more growth and expansion that's happening, there's a higher transfer of resources that happen from the non-capitalist segments, dispossessing these workers, who then have to reproduce their conditions of livelihood in another kind of outside. Another example is when I was giving the example of, let's say, the subcontracting work, etc. That as well as okay, so let me skip over that. But basically, those are the contradictory processes that I'm talking about. And last, what I want to submit here is that these processes and these contradictions are centrally embedded as a part of the process of capitalist development, and they reveal themselves much more readily in the experience of the post-colonial economies. However, these are even the experience of the global north in terms of the rise of gig work, platform economy, and much of it being informal in nature. They're also revealing themselves in terms of the experience of the global north, so much more. And through that, what we're trying to do is unsettle the imaginary of like this endogenous capitalist development that underpin the Eurocentric understandings of development and the world over. So I'll stop here, but I know I skipped over a lot of parts, but I'm very happy to take questions and talk a little bit more about it. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Surbhi. My notes are all over the place and I feel like many of the people will probably share this feeling in the room. I can see that there are already some questions in the question and answer section. Just to remind you again, please, if you have some questions, and really please, like whatever it is, please do feel free to ask it, and so we can discuss and communally learn here. You can still use the like button to vote something up. And remember that if you ask it anonymously, I will read the question out loud. If you ask using your name, I will ask you to unmute so you can ask Surbhi yourself. Surbhi, can I ask you to stop sharing your screen, and then we can like see you bigger when you engage with all of the questions?
Yes.
Great. Okay. So, boy, wow, there are like a lot of questions with quite some detail to it. Okay, I think I would start with giving the floor to Madhushree. You have two questions. May I ask you to kind of synthesize both of them? I know they're like two different topics, but to go into both of the aspects that you said. Wait, and now I have to unmute you. Give me one. Okay. I think you should be able to talk now.
Hi, thank you for your talk. It was really great. So like my questions sort of come from this. I'm trying to understand that how do we even sort of reframe our understanding, or like decolonize our understanding of development outside the frameworks, outside Eurocentric frameworks. Like, for example, in India, we still have the dual economies. Like we do have a very feudal interior, which is informed heavily by caste and patriarchy. And so how do we understand how capitalism is sort of working with these to become something which is not really explained by Eurocentric models? And like a follow-up to that was it's becoming, so I also work as a development practitioner, although I'm very young. In my limited experience, it feels harder to imagine and engage in ways of development that sort of shift away from the mainstream narratives that we've been taught. And it becomes even harder, sort of like capitalist realism. You can't really imagine an alternative, especially because of the way funders are informing the development sector and the ever-growing influence of fascism in India. So yeah, it seems like to me sometimes that there is no way forward and there is nothing to fall back to. So yeah, that was my question.
Okay, thanks, Madhushree. I'm not that young and I still don't have answers to a lot of questions, particularly about optimism that you're asking. So I'm gonna attempt to answer the two things that you've. Let me approach the first question first. Reframing our understanding and how do we think about feudalism, caste, patriarchy, etc. I think like one of the really interesting advice that was given to me by one of my teachers was that it's interesting when in the existing frameworks you try to build bring in questions of caste and patriarchy, etc. A lot of times, it's not just about including just one variable, but you can actually see your entire framework and model changing because you're no more able to explain based on that framework. And I feel like that is a very interesting point for me as a starting point to think about it, that, look, there are various ways in which Eurocentrism can be defined. And when I talk about it in terms of this sort of endogenous capitalist development of sorts, then if we begin by that framework, of course, as you rightly mentioned, that a lot of issues of caste and patriarchy are not within that framework, and we're trying to expand our framework in possible ways it could. What that would mean is that even when we are exploring issues of labor, when we're exploring issues of work, etc., the issues of caste and patriarchy have to be married into it. And a framework that doesn't do that in many ways is, in fact, to put it mildly, incomplete. And in that case, what becomes a useful exercise is to think about which of the frameworks that are available to us from different economic schools of thought lend themselves best in order to incorporate, let's say, the issues of caste, issues of patriarchy, etc. For example, in the Marxian Resnick-Wolf sort of framework, there's very interesting work by Gibson Graham, who introduced patriarchy as another element and kind of tried to see how the Marxian frameworks itself would evolve. So in that case, one thing one has to realize is that capitalism can function with caste and patriarchy, and in fact can function better for capital. In fact, caste and patriarchy helps in the accumulation process because you can discriminate against wages, you can have someone taking care of things in the household. There's this paper by Gibson Graham which says for every knight in shining armor, there's a castle waiting to be cleaned. So it's like for capitalism, it's a good sort of pact to have with caste and patriarchy. And this is something exactly we have been seeing in India, and something, for example, capitalism is extremely racialized, and that has in fact aided the development of capitalism even in the global north. So a non-Eurocentric understanding in that way will in fact center this idea of racialization, which again this endogenous capitalist development part wouldn't really recognize, because the entire history of colonialism is kind of written off. Similarly, the entire history of how caste operates in tandem with capitalism is kind of written off. So again, the point would be that to build frameworks that do marry the two, and some, in terms of whether we can think about dual economies and, particularly when there's feudal, etc., in the non-Eurocentric ways. My argument here is capitalism itself is a fractured space. It indeed comprises of capitalist and non-capitalist segments. It is not the homogeneous space, which is the essence of capitalism, which the European experience is expected to further. That's one part of the argument. The second part of the argument is that even that European experience that's kind of projected as the essence is in fact partial. Even there, it didn't happen. It was based on racial differentiation. It was based on racialization, colonialism, transatlantic slave trade, so on and so forth, which in fact, all of these created that what Europe came to be, but was projected in a very partial understanding. So it's dismantling all of those. And yeah, about the second question about pessimism and optimism, I often think of this quote by Gramsci, which says, pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. So it is, in fact, very difficult times, but I think the history of capitalism is very recent, right? And I think reading just much more economic history kind of gives you much more optimism as well, because it's not like a very old system. It's a system that is very, very recent. And why is it that we want to accept it as the system, given that slave trade was something that was so recent, right? And so many things that are quote unquote illegal right now was something that was there in legally very recent times. One thing that I often say is that it's one thing to think about that, we have to be embedded in development practice, etc. And I see there's another question on it, and I'll talk about it when I address that. But I think it's very important to think about how all of these are going into political organization. There has to be some way in which rights-based movement, people's movement can be strengthened so that because we don't always have to go to that old capital wage labor fractures, which is another point that I want to make from the thing. Given that we can identify fractures even between capital and its outside. So different development practices that you do, there is a need to politically organize along all of these lines, not just as wage labor and capital, which is like an established struggle, but also that between these non-capitalist informal spaces and that the interior sphere of capital. And that sort of sphere also needs to be, with any sort of practice that we are doing, has to be accompanied by, in any way, facilitating political agency of the people you're engaging with in order to allow for that sort of organization to take place.
Thank you. That also clarified some things for me. I hope for the person who asked the question as well. This was kind of clarifying. One reminder to all of the participants, please have a look into the Q&A and vote up the questions that you like most, considering that I'm not sure if we get to all of the questions, so we kind of really do want to prioritize the ones that we have. The one that is up next is anonymous. I will try to read out the central points of it. And it's kind of asking you coming from why you're coming from this specific approach. So it's asking, so why do you call your endeavors of dismantling endogenous theological views of capitalism as a South-centric view? And the person says that this understanding has been challenged in the so-called Notes to Self, I believe, by Foucault or Benjamin. Moreover, this understanding has now been embraced by the South. This dismantling has to happen from the globe, right? And can you say your questions are really emerging from your global South experiences, or is it arising from being familiar with critical thought produced in the global North and South? So I think also, where is knowledge coming from that is being used? I think this is what is being addressed.
Right. I have certain clarifications to make. The parts of it that I'm not sure I understand, but I'll attempt to answer. And Lena, please do feel free to fill in the gaps if you think you can help me with something. I'm not sure where I understand that these understandings have been challenged in the North itself. Sure, that's why I said I'm not talking about a geographical North and a geographical South, right? The idea is, of course, okay, so let me address a big question. Was Marx Eurocentric? That's kind of a favorite question that everybody has. So he was based in the global North. He was talking about a European experience. So was he North-centric or not? So I think one can't put Marxian strands or all of Marxian strands in a Eurocentric frame. There are a lot that still get informed by the teleological view, where their idea is that, oh, we need to basically have the proletarianization of the workers, we need to have them as more wage workers, and that's when we're going to fight for whatever, right? But there are various other strands of Marxian theory itself, including Marx himself, which are building frameworks which allow you to take into account these other kind of contradiction that a Southern experience kind of brings to fore. That's point one. The second point that I want to make is about Marx being Eurocentric. He, in fact, was someone who centered this contradiction of capital versus labor. And I'm saying that even this contradiction, to a large part, kind of gets written off in this teleological sort of understanding that kind of gets projected as the endogenous capitalist development sort of understanding. However, then there are other parts of the contradictions that I was talking about, which do not get accepted in the dominant paradigm in the global North. But of course, that is exactly why I think heterodox theories are most amenable to be decolonizing, because their frameworks center these contradictions that I believe are most important in order for us to develop a decolonized understanding. So it's not just about the people who are saying that. Of course, there is going to be a difference in who is basically speaking the knowledge, etc. But I do agree that this is not really the critical thought. You're right. It can be available from both global North and South. So if eurocentrism kind of gets equated with this idea of an endogenous capitalist development, then any anti-capitalist strands, most anti-capitalist strands to begin with, will take somewhat of a non-Eurocentric position. And therefore, it's not surprising that even heterodoxy is excluded even in the global North, because it's taking a position which is counter to that view. Of course, not all heterodox views are sufficiently decolonized, but they do give us frameworks which allow us to kind of move towards this decolonized understanding.
Thank you. I think that was how I would read the question, is kind of what you addressed, and really thank you also for like contextualizing where is heterodoxy in like this whole span of global North, global South, where knowledge comes from. And I think it's a really good point, looking at where is what knowledge excluded to kind of answer or like get into that question. I would take another live question from the chat, and I think Isan had a question. So I'm gonna give you the right to unmute yourself, and please ask your question directly to Surbhi.
Thanks, Surbhi. That was a really interesting presentation. My question is actually more towards the beginning of your talk, and not towards so much the second half of the talk, which was extremely interesting, and about the endogenous transition. Just in terms of the beginning of the talk where you talked about development as capitalist transition, I mean, for a while now, the way development is understood, even in the kind of mainstream, is more about Sen type welfare indicators, and the primary path towards development is seen as upgrading of average labor productivity, and not necessarily through capitalism. And an example of that would be something like, nobody would say China's not developing, even though it's more state-driven. Of course, there are lots of other things around it, but that's the point. And so in this framing of development as capitalist, well, or any productivity transition, what other parts of development are you thinking of as a measure of development? And of course, the actual process of development, as you've really nicely talked about for the second half, is very different. That's South-centric. But here I'm just asking about a measure of development. What other kind of parts are you thinking of that doesn't involve upgrading of productivity? Thanks.
Thanks, Ehsan, for the question. In terms of, there being a shift in the whole development machinery, so to say, to having become welfare driven, etc. I'll speak a little bit to that, because that also relates to one of the first questions on funders informing development and stuff as well. But on the second part, I'm not sure I have an answer to what are the other ways to measure development. Like, there could be many, right? Like even if one is talking about a Sen kind of a measure, but the idea is even Sen kind of measures get appropriated in this very sort of frameworks where, he was the one person who's always been anti-Schultz, and basically Sen's measures of development of, education, are basically made into these metrics and trying to be captured in those frameworks. So the point here is, I think what I'm inviting you and others to do is to think about, to actually think about that answer of what development could look like. What is an endogenous development, which is not marked by this teleological vision, could potentially look like? And I'm not providing the answer to that. I don't have an answer to that. The simple point that I'm trying to make here is that development does get equated to that of capitalist transition. Your first part of the question is that probably it is not. And I think that's what I want to speak to. The entire welfare-driven machinery that comes into being after 70s, or particularly after the 90s, is basically some way of the entire development paradigm kind of assuming that we are all capitalists now, right? And it's basically an all-pervasive capitalism now, which is functioning in very similar ways in global North and South. That is why this entire issue of development also becomes a question now in the global North. And the entire machinery becomes that of smaller intervention in order to tweak and in order to fix the problems that are brought forth by by the lack of development. And the entire thing becomes that of poverty fetishization, etc. And here if you look at the development paradigm, which is then not talking about structural transformation, the idea becomes, look, we are all the informal enterprises by the World Bank discourse, etc., get framed as the micro-entrepreneurial capitalist enterprises who actually have a lot of dynamic potential, and they're kind of the frontiers of the growth process, etc. So it's like literally a papering over the entire idea, where even they are now being looked as, in fact, capitalist enterprises, which they're not. For them, the issue of transition, to a large part, is either complete, if you take a World Bank sort of a discourse. If you take some part of the ILO kind of discourse, they still remain embedded in that structural transformation sort of an idea. And the entire welfare-driven machinery, in fact, is speaking to the failure of the development process. Why so? Because what tends to happen, what is really happening, and what I was talking about, this process of primitive accumulation being ever going and incomplete, is one of that, look, you dispossess this huge amount of people, you're not being able to absorb them as wage workers, which is what you promised, right? Like that is the development as capitalist transition. That is not really happening. Now, what is happening to those that are kind of left over? They will cause a huge political upheaval if they're not given a basic means to survive. And that is why there's this huge thing of basic income. There's this huge sort of move towards microcredit loans, et cetera, which are in fact funded by these big philanthropy organizations, funded by the big capital. And therefore, big capital, in fact, in some sense, can kind of give some kickbacks, which allows a lot of these people who are in fact casualties of the entire development process to continue to subsist, such that they do not cause political upheaval in the economies. And it is that kind of a process which is intricately linked to the idea of development as capitalist transition, even if it's not being projected as that. It's basically saying, sorry, just a thought. There's this very interesting book by Gibson Graham again, which is called End of Capitalism, bracket, as we knew it. So there's this new kind of capitalism that's kind of become accepted. But in my mind, to think of this later phase not as one which is growing still from that outfall of that capitalist transition idea is something that I disagree with. And that's kind of, I think, the premise of your question itself, because that's still sort of an outfall of that earlier phase that's coming into being. And it's just that the idea now is that, look, there are these casualties of development. We can't come and accept that that entire capitalist transition is actually a failed thing. We're going to come out and say that, look, that's already happened. And whatever the casualties are, we're going to keep giving them some transfers and kickbacks so that they don't create political upheavals in the economy. And I think that's what is kind of the tension here. About your second part, as I said, I don't know the answer to it. Of course, there are possible mechanisms that people talk about in terms of, if that sort of transition can't happen, could we look at a state-driven sort of mechanism? Could we look at a sort of community-based mechanisms? Could we look at distributive justice and centering distributive justice? Because look, there's enough wealth and resources in the world, so it's not a scarcity of resources, it's an issue of distribution. Could we look at organization along the lines of transfer, such that they can be more smaller scale industries, which are more labor intensive, can kind of be set up, which can provide enough resources and increase the welfare of the people? And so those are all possible paths which are open for exploration. And here I'm not giving an answer to that because that's not what my research is also speaking to. Thank you. But thank you for the very interesting question.
Thanks.
Thank you. There's a question that relates to that. If it's okay for, like, obviously attendees can easily leave. So if it's okay for you, maybe can we keep you around 10 minutes longer, but because then we can actually like finish all of the questions. And I would pull one question up that relates to what you just said at the end, kind of a clarification thing on this. Like all of them are related to the outset, but one person's asking, so is it that you're saying that notions of reserve army of labor and the urban poor, to use like Hegelian phrase, are not sufficiently explained by what you call your eurocentric views of capitalism? And I think this kind of links to the latest point that you just made. Maybe you can clarify a bit on that.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for asking for that clarification, because the idea of a reserve army of labor, what Marx will also talk about, the idea will still be that, look, those are something that capital will need to incorporate and will help keep wages low. And there will be cycles in which the reserve army would expand and the reserve army would deplete. So they're basically satisfying a particular economic need of the capital. But what I'm saying here is that this vast non-capitalist outside, one of the segments of the informal economy, which is the non-capitalist outside the household-based self-employed enterprises, they're not serving any economic need for capital. And that for me is like, think about this, 80% informal economy. You don't need an 80% reserve army to keep the wages of 20% low. You can do it with much lower, basically. Similarly, people like Prabhat Patnaik, etc., would also talk about, look, there's this provision of cheap wage goods that's happening from a lot of these sectors, which can happen with another part of informality, which I was talking about in terms of subcontracting linkages, etc. But then there's this huge part which is not satisfying any economic need, contra to what the reserve army's role has been. It's in fact completely surplus for capitalist accumulation. It can help decrease the wage level, but you don't need such a huge pool of labor to actually be doing that. It's in fact a drag on capital to a large extent, but capital can't really, under a democratic system more broadly, whatever, problematically functioning, you can't let people to die. But then what you have to do is provide them certain kickbacks so that there's not political upheavals as a reaction to this.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. And as I said, the others kind of also linked to this concept of the outside, because I think it is something to like rethink or think differently on this outside, and what does it mean and is it needed, and kind of with this other marks in terms of like reserve army, how do they link together? And so like the last two questions are related to this outside realm. Maybe the first one being more on a clarification again. So if the informal space that you call outside of the capital is simply marked by struggle and desire to come inside of the capital, i.e. wage work, then how is it generally outside? So this is not clear. And then I would put the second question right behind it. It's kind of asking for more of a practical approach to this outside again. So where the reproduction of the outside of capitalism involving microcredits, etc., in order to keep the overall capitalist structure itself successfully reproducing in keeping people's lives and livelihood together, given how entrenched it has become in some parts of the global south, how would you approach deconstructing this relation in practical terms when it has become so central to people's day-to-day experiences?
Thanks, Lena, and thanks for this question. So I'll address the first one that you posed to me. So first of all, let me clarify, not all of informal space is outside. One informal space is, let's say, the informal wage labor that are very much internal to the sphere of capital, because they are marked by this wage labor relation. It's just that they are way more precarious, and that kind of becomes a tool to kind of make the labor market less tight, etc. So that's internal. Then there are ones that are created by the dispersion of capital to its outside, which are not a pure outside of sorts, because they are linked to capital. They're providing some economic need to it, economically satisfying certain needs for it. For example, the subcontracting linkages, subcontracted enterprises, the gig work, platform work, but they're not completely internal, even though it'll be better for them if they'll be internal, because, there are ways that they can have more bargaining power as a labor. As you might know, many Uber drivers have been trying to register themselves as a worker, because then they can actually access labor rights, which to platform workers, you're like a self-employed entrepreneur, so you don't basically have access to it. What about the complete outside? That part of informal economy, it's genuinely outside in terms of the production and the labor process. Whether you want to be a part of the inside, if it's going to make your lives better off, yes, you would. But it's an outside, not in terms of whether you have a desire or not to be internal. You'd always want to be in the inside and the internal core. But in terms of the production and labor processes that I'm theoretically talking about, it's an outside. Because in much of the Marxian literature and in mainstream literature, the idea would be, okay, the various ways in which informal economy is conceptualized. But one that is relevant for your question here is that there the idea would be, look, this outside only exists. It doesn't have any independent means of existence. it exists only to satisfy certain economic needs for capital. That is, it can depress wage work, it can provide cheap wage goods, etc. So it's basically the need of capital. So it's like a functionalist explanation. That is, it's functionally tethered to the sphere of capital, that its existence is derived from the need of capital, economic need of capital. Here, what I'm saying is that no, that's not true. There is, in fact, a large part of it which is not serving any useful economic function for capital as well. But it has to subsist because otherwise these people, if not absorbed anywhere, can cause political upheavals in the economy. So what it's doing is, which is basically an argument of Kalyan Sanyal, who is basically arguing that this sphere is then providing the political need, and in that sense it's outside because it's not linked to capital in terms of any economic need per se, and it's not integrated with it in terms of any production and labor process. So this outside sphere is not linked through subcontracting linkages or through gig work. They're an independent logic of existence of their own, which are driven by subsistence and ensuring the subsistence need of the household. So on the second question, where the reproduction of outside of capitalism in order to keep overall capitalist structure itself successfully reproducing is keeping people's lives and livelihoods together, given how entrenched it has become a part of the global south. How would you approach deconstructing this relation in practical terms when it has come to become so central to people's day-to-day existence? It's a very interesting and deep question because, a lot of times that we talk about basic income, microcredit access and stuff, a lot of that is actually won through people's movements. It's not that the state is like, oh, wow, I want you to kind of settle down, so let me just kind of give you this. Of course, a lot of the big basic income programs that we've been talking about have come via people's struggle. But what really ends up happening is that those kind of tend to become measures which do not necessarily lead into any transformative sort of thing. The idea is often to think about organizing now, not just along the labor lines and wage labor lines that, Marx and other people would also be talking about, but also along the lines of that with the space of the outside. And that, of course, manifests in terms of really strong people's movements and rights-based movement that I talked about earlier, which again goes towards organization, that the way to engage with it is, you can be very happy if, let's say, for example, in my country, in India, you're provided some kickbacks in terms of being given some small cash award. And people think that, wow, that's so good. And that's basically big capital hand in hand with the fastest government. They don't really have to do something for transforming the economy. But what that lends itself very well to do is basically giving some kickbacks to the people, and they will go and support you. So it's like you don't have to do much of the dirty work in terms of transforming the economy. So in terms of engagement with people, then it actually becomes that of political consciousness about being an equal stakeholder in this entire process, even as a citizen, not just as a wage worker, but even as a citizen, as an economic citizen, not just someone who's getting kickbacks in order to just ensure, but this is all something that's being taken away from me, and everybody has an equal access, an equal right over the entire resource produced. So that is one way I can think of how it can become a central part of people's day-to-day life in terms of negotiating with the state, in terms of negotiating with everybody in places of power, and therefore organization to be thought of, and labor organization to be thought of outside just the domain of wage work.
Nice, thank you. I think also the note on ending on organization of labor and organization in general is kind of a nice point to close this. And we have already someone putting in the chat, thank you for all of the detailed answers and that they really enjoyed the talk. I can obviously only speak for myself, but for me too, thank you. This was really insightful, pulling many different ideas together and kind of giving it this interesting perspective of what is a framework and how can we approach it. I'm really excited for like the forthcoming paper. And I think I can maybe also speak with some others on that. Yeah, thank you. So I think we would close this now. This has been already quite a day of Summer Academy, and I think now my head is spinning, and I think from all of the others too, but in a really positive way. And it's really late for you. So yeah, thank you so much, Sylvie, for coming and talking to us about this today. It was really
Thanks a
cool.
lot, Lena. Thanks for inviting me. I definitely enjoyed the questions and engagement with you and others. I mean, with you as always and with others. So thanks a lot. I hope that wasn't too all over the place. I was trying to weave in various thoughts, but I truly did enjoy myself. So thanks again for having me.
Thank you so much. And to all of the other participants, so the participants of the Summer Academy, we will see you tomorrow. There will be workshops starting and we have the socializing and getting to know. To all of the people who are joining us from outside, please stay tuned for all of the other public evening lectures that we have. There are many more topics to cover throughout the weekend, like really interesting speakers. So yeah, I'm happy to see some of you again in what form soever, and have a good evening and a good night or a good morning wherever you are. Thank you. Bye-bye.